I never thought I'd be afraid of the wind until my first night alone on the west catwalk of the rig. The lights were rotating slowly, painting long shadows across the steel platforms, and the air pressed against my helmet in ways that didn't feel natural. I remember pausing to listen, and for a moment I thought I heard words riding the currents, too precise to be random. That's when it hit me. I was supposed to follow 11 strange rules just to make it through the night, but I didn't know them all yet. I reached for my radio, hesitated, and felt the air shift behind me like someone or something was waiting for me to speak first. I learned the first night why Rule 1, never respond to whispers carried by the wind, existed the hard way, standing alone on the west catwalk while the lights spun slowly above me, casting long, impossible shadows across the steel. The wind didn't just brush past, it curled and twisted around my jacket, pressing against my helmet as though it could feel my pulse. At first I convinced myself it was just the normal settling of the rig, the metal contracting, the sea moving in its usual rhythm, but every instinct told me this was different. I whispered the rule to myself over and over, like a lifeline, as the shadows deepened, and I could feel unseen eyes moving in rhythm with the gusts. My flashlight sliced the darkness into rectangles of light, yet each rectangle seemed to carry more shadow at its edges than it should, like the wind was dragging darkness along with it, shaping it around me personally. Time lost meaning as the night stretched, the wind testing my awareness, brushing along the back of my neck and shoulders with a deliberate gentleness that made my skin crawl. I told myself I had to ignore it, had to stand still, repeat Rule 1. Never respond to whispers carried by the wind, in my mind, and let it pass. But the air had a weight I hadn't anticipated. Every breath felt measured, the cold pressing into my chest and twisting as if in response to the smallest movement I made. I tried walking, pacing the catwalk slowly, counting steps against the hazard lights, but the wind adjusted instantly, curling around my ankles, brushing my sleeves, and dragging the echoes of my own steps back to me distorted. I realized that simply staying silent wasn't protection. The act of existing alone here meant the wind would test every limit of my attention and my restraint. By the third hour, exhaustion gnawed at me, but stopping didn't help. Each turn of the catwalk brought the same pattern, a curl of air along my arm, the faint sensation of a fingertip grazing my jacket, and a shadow that lingered at the edge of vision longer than physics should allow. I remembered other men's warnings, offhand mutterings about the wind and voices, and the fact that Rule 1 existed didn't make me feel safer. It made me feel like every mistake would be remembered. I started murmuring my own name, softly, to see if it would pass unnoticed, but the wind responded in ways that were almost tangible, tugging at my jacket, pushing against my helmet in the spaces between breaths. I realized too late that anticipation alone was a kind of trap. The moment you expected the wind to act, it changed, testing not only what you feared, but how you feared it. The hours dragged into a fog of uncertainty. I tried switching the flashlight off for a while, thinking darkness might reset the pattern, but even without the light, the wind adapted, pressing against my shoulders, brushing through my hair, wrapping around me like an invisible cord. I started mapping it silently, tracing its movement, counting the small variations in pressure and direction, hoping to predict it, but it was smarter than I was, bending around corners and beams, moving in anticipation rather than reaction. The rig itself seemed to lean in, amplifying the sensation that the wind wasn't part of the natural world anymore, but something personal, something that could measure hesitation and patience, and respond accordingly. I remembered the first paragraph warning, Rule 1, never respond to whispers carried by the wind, and it felt like repeating it in my mind might be the only thing holding me upright. Every step I considered taking was a negotiation with the unseen presence. Every movement carried the possibility that I had misjudged its intentions. I could feel my thoughts fragmenting, noticing details I hadn't before, the metallic tang of the air, the faint change in temperature as the wind brushed against me. and the eerie, precise timing of its swirls around the catwalk. Even in my exhaustion, I knew that the wind was aware of me in a way no human could be, attentive to hesitation, responsive to thought itself. I tried calling out once, testing it with a single word, just to hear a response, but the second it left my lips, the wind shifted violently, dragging a long chill along my spine and curling tightly around my elbows and shoulders. The lights above me flickered in perfect synchrony, casting shadows that I could swear moved independently of their sources, and for a moment I froze completely. Every instinct screamed that I had broken Rule 1, never respond to whispers carried by the wind, even though I had only tried a single soft word, and that awareness was crushing in its weight. My body tensed involuntarily, muscles straining against phantom pressure points, and I understood that this rule wasn't about punishment, it was about survival, about not giving the wind even the smallest invitation. I walked again, slowly, counting each step against the metal grates beneath my boots, noticing subtle changes in pressure against my chest and back as the wind moved with a sentience I couldn't comprehend. I remembered fragments of stories from others, men who had vanished, never found, last seen talking quietly to themselves about voices that answered them. The memory twisted in my mind like a low current, and I realized that following Rule 1 wasn't just about staying silent, it was about keeping your mind from wandering into patterns the wind could exploit. I felt the edges of my perception stretch thin, noticing shadows within shadows, reflections in steel that didn't belong to anything I could see directly, and the tiny tug at my awareness that made each heartbeat feel like a drumbeat calling something closer. By the time dawn threatened on the horizon, my body ached and my mind was fraying. I hadn't responded, I had obeyed Rule 1, never respond to whispers carried by the wind, but I felt hollowed, like part of me had been rearranged without permission. Every sound, every movement of the rig, every shift in the wind, seemed to carry subtle messages I couldn't interpret, messages I wasn't sure I wanted to. I realized that following the first rule wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of understanding how small and fragile my control really was in the middle of the night, alone on a platform that had once felt mechanical, but now pulsed with an awareness I couldn't see. Even as sunlight began to seep over the horizon, I didn't feel relief. The wind had only retreated slightly, lingering in corners and around edges, as if testing my resolve, and I knew that the next night would not be the same, that every following hour would bend according to something I could not yet name. I stayed on the catwalk, eyes following the empty space below, and felt a strange, tight pressure at my chest, an invisible awareness measuring my patience. And still I remembered the rule, its weight anchoring me while everything else seemed to twist. Rule 1, never respond to whispers carried by the wind. I should have known my mind was starting to unravel when Rule 2, always keep your eyes on the monitors, even when they seem to show nothing, felt heavier than the steel catwalk beneath my boots. I wandered into the control room with exhaustion gnawing at every joint, and the blinking screens seemed more like living eyes than machines, shifting slightly whenever I glanced away. For hours I watched lines of data scroll past, meaningless numbers twisting into patterns I couldn't unsee. And the more I stared, the more the edges of the monitors seemed to breathe, pulse and tilt as if aware of my gaze. Every time I thought I saw something move on one screen, my rational mind argued it was just reflection, shadow, or fatigue. But then a flicker at the corner of my eye would insist it wasn't. My heartbeat thumped like a metronome, syncing with the slow, imperceptible vibrations of the monitors, and I realized I was beginning to doubt whether I was controlling my own focus or letting it be pulled by some unseen force. Hours bled into each other. The rig was silent except for the occasional hum of machinery and the far-off slap of waves, but the control room felt claustrophobic, almost alive. I began noticing tiny inconsistencies, numbers that hadn't been there a second ago, a cursor moving a fraction of an inch when I wasn't touching it, and screens that flickered even without power surges. I repeated Rule 2 in my mind like a mantra, hoping that obeying it would keep me tethered to reality. I started talking quietly to myself, to maintain a sense of time, saying things like, "Just the screens, just the numbers, just the screens," over and over. But the repetition only made the monitors feel sharper, more deliberate, as if they were listening and responding in ways I couldn't quantify. My eyes ached from focus. My mind started seeing patterns that weren't there, connecting lines of data to imaginary forms moving in the shadows, and I realized I had crossed some invisible line between vigilance and obsession. The monitors became mirrors, reflecting not the rig or my face but fragments of memories I hadn't consciously remembered. I swore I could see my father's silhouette in the patterns of green and amber light, though he had been gone years. I saw glimpses of the men who had trained me, the fleeting expressions of impatience, anger, or warning flashing in the wrong places. I questioned my own mind. Was it memory corruption, or was the rig showing me things I hadn't experienced? I could feel myself slipping, every blink a risk, every twitch of the cursor or flicker of the screen tugging at my perception. My hands hovered over the controls, twitching reflexively, and I realized the longer I stared, the more I feared leaving even a moment of the display unattended. Sleep became impossible. My body wanted rest, but the monitors demanded attention. Each time I considered turning away for even a single second, the screens would pulse in ways that felt accusatory. I started imagining shapes crawling behind the translucent layers of data, and though I knew rationally they weren't there, my heart could not ignore them. Rule 2: always keep your eyes on the monitors, even when they seem to show nothing, was no longer just advice. It had become an obligation, a subtle leash around my sanity. I noticed small ticks in the data that corresponded to my thoughts, a sequence of numbers that changed when I tried to blink, graphs that shifted as my mind wandered. Every small deviation felt like it was recorded, a reflection of my weakening mental state. As the night stretched on, I began murmuring to the screens, softly asking questions about events I could not explain, trying to make sense of the patterns. At first I thought it was a sign of fatigue, but the monitors reacted, subtle blips and shifts in brightness as if acknowledging me. I realized I had stopped distinguishing between what was real and what was projection. My eyes were glued to the monitors not because of necessity, but because they had become the axis around which my reality rotated. My reflection was no longer my own. It merged with numbers, flickers, and shadows, and the more I obeyed the rule, the more I feared that leaving the screens unattended would erase me entirely from the rig's memory. Even meals became impossible. I tried to step away, briefly, to sip water, but the screens seemed to tighten around me, every blink bringing new forms and distortions. I could hear my own thoughts echoing against the walls, questioning every movement, every hesitation, every imagined shift in the data. I realized that by obeying Rule 2, I had allowed my mind to stretch into spaces it had never known, watching for things that didn't exist while ignoring what did. Every small flicker of the monitors felt like a test, a measurement of how much I could endure before my perception shattered completely. I could not leave, and yet I feared staying, knowing that the rig had already begun feeding off my attention, twisting vigilance into obsession. By the 5th hour, my hands were trembling, my vision was dotted with after-images, and the blinking lights had begun to take on the appearance of faces I didn't recognize. I caught myself whispering apologies to the screens, silent promises to obey the rule, and for a moment, I wondered if I had already failed. I traced shapes on the monitor glass with a shaking finger, trying to ground myself in logic, but the more I traced, the more the images seemed to respond, almost smiling, as if aware of my futile attempt. My chest tightened with every passing second, the shadows in the corner of the room stretching and curling in ways I could not calculate. Even in complete isolation, I felt eyes on me, eyes born from the intersection of data and fatigue, watching my slow psychological collapse. Hours, or maybe minutes, became irrelevant. I could no longer tell whether my trembling hands were a result of fatigue, fear, or the influence of the rig itself. Every time I moved, the monitors shifted subtly, reacting in ways that defied explanation. I started counting blinks, breaths, and cursors, keeping mental tallies to maintain some semblance of control, yet the rule remained clear. Rule 2, always keep your eyes on the monitors, even when they seem to show nothing. Obedience was no longer a choice. It had become the axis of my sanity, and the rig was watching closely, judging every lapse, every distraction, every thought that dared wander from the glowing rectangles of light. By the early morning, I felt my mind stretch thin, threads of reality fraying. As I continued to watch, the monitors reflected not only the rig, but fragments of me I hadn't seen before. Fear, doubt, exhaustion, all exaggerated into grotesque forms. Every flicker, every number, every cursor movement seemed purposeful, alive and aware of my presence. I understood, with a creeping certainty, that Rule 2 was less about the monitors themselves, and more about controlling what remained of my own mind, because the moment attention faltered, the rig would consume what sanity remained. And even as sunlight threatened the horizon, I could not move. My gaze remained locked, my body frozen, my thoughts bound to the shifting patterns as the slow decay of my own mind deepened with every passing second. I learned the true cost of neglecting Rule 3. Always check the supply hatches twice before leaving the platform. On a night when the wind had quieted, but the rig didn't feel any safer. I had been tasked with delivering supplies to the lower levels, thinking the rig would remain predictable if I stayed cautious. The hatches were old, their locks stiff from years of saltwater corrosion, and I convinced myself that one glance and a push would be enough. But something in the shadows of the hatchways felt alive, as if the steel itself remembered every hand that had ever opened it. I ignored the faint whisper of warning in my chest, brushing off the weight of the rule I had recited like a lifeline. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just responsible for supplies. I was responsible for survival. Every step down the graded stairs felt like stepping deeper into a judgment I could not see, but could feel pressing on my shoulders. By the time I reached the lower deck, the air had thickened with humidity and the smell of oil that had seeped from storage tanks long ago. The supply hatches were in neat rows, their handles glinting faintly under the dim fluorescent lights. I bent down to check the first hatch, giving it a firm push, and convinced myself it was secure. The second hatch, however, gave a subtle resistance that felt almost like a pulse under my palm, as though it had been waiting for recognition. I hesitated, heart hammering, recalling the rule again silently. Rule 3, always check the supply hatches twice before leaving the platform. My mind raced, wondering if the pressure I felt was fatigue, imagination, or something far more tangible. The quiet hum of machinery around me suddenly felt oppressive, like a crowd of unseen eyes scrutinizing my every move. I had started down this platform, thinking the rule was simple, almost mundane, but the deeper I went, the more I realized how thin the line between carelessness and catastrophe was. One hatch left unchecked could mean equipment failure, a slip in the rig's rotation schedule, or worse, exposure to the hidden hazards of the platform. As I pushed open the second hatch, I thought I saw movement, a flicker at the corner of my eye that made my stomach twist. It wasn't just the rig demanding obedience. It was survival itself measuring my attention, testing whether I would follow the rule completely. My mind began replaying scenes from earlier nights, imagining the consequences of missing a single detail, and I felt the weight of potential errors pressing on me like the weight of steel above. The longer I checked each hatch, the more aware I became of the mistakes I had made in previous nights. I could feel every lapse in attention as though it had left a mark on the rig, and guilt crept in with every shift of the platform beneath me. Memories of past oversights, forgotten tools, missed minor repairs, shortcuts I had taken, flooded my mind, each one amplified in the quiet of the lower decks. I whispered apologies to the empty corridors, hoping the rule itself might forgive me, though I knew better. The hatch handles seemed to resist my hands more as I went, subtle irregularities that forced me to pause and consider each motion. By checking twice, I wasn't just obeying a rule, I was trying to repair trust between myself and the platform, and I realized that guilt was heavier than any weight I had lifted that night. Hours passed with slow, deliberate movements as I traced every hatch, checking and rechecking with exacting care. I felt my muscles stiffen and my mind fray, haunted by the knowledge that missing even one hatch could trigger a chain reaction of consequences I couldn't foresee. The rig seemed to breathe around me, the air thick with the scent of machinery and salt water, and I could feel a subtle judgment in every vibration and metallic groan. Each hatch seemed to demand acknowledgement, pressing against my hands as if aware of my hesitation, and I started questioning whether my own perception of time and space was reliable. My head spun with calculations and second guesses, and yet I pressed on, driven by the silent understanding that Rule 3, always check the supply hatches twice before leaving the platform, was more than instruction. It was my tether to survival. Even after finishing the checks, I could not relax. Every shadow along the deck seemed heavier, every creak of steel sharper, as if the rig itself remembered the brief moments of oversight I had taken for granted in the past. I felt my conscience replay every misstep, every night I had allowed fatigue or distraction to dictate my actions, each one magnified in the dim light of the lower decks. My mind twisted possibilities, imagining what could have happened if I had skipped one check, and the weight of guilt bore down on me so completely that I could barely lift my hands to operate the next set of tools. The rig was patient, and it allowed me to feel the full scope of responsibility, to understand through fear and regret the magnitude of Rule 3. By the time I began returning to the upper platforms, my muscles were trembling, my lungs tight, and my mind hazy with lingering panic. The dim light of the early morning cast shadows in ways that made familiar stairways seem alien, and I could not trust that what I had seen, or imagined seeing, was real. Every step I retraced reminded me of the invisible ledger of mistakes I had accumulated over nights of partial obedience, each misstep echoing silently in my mind. I realized that the psychological burden of survival guilt was more punishing than any storm, any mechanical failure, or any physical hazard. The rig had its own rhythm, and my lapses in attentiveness had shifted it subtly, leaving me to reckon with consequences I could not undo. Even when I reached the upper catwalk, the weight of Rule 3, always check the supply hatches twice before leaving the platform, pressed down, a mental echo I could not ignore. I realized that the simple act of obedience carried with it a constant reminder of the fragility of my position, and that the rig, the sea, and my own lapses were all intertwined in a delicate balance that demanded perfection. My body wanted to rest, but my mind refused, replaying each hatch, each shadow, each imagined flicker of movement as though punishment could be delivered retroactively. I understood finally that survival was not merely physical but psychological. Every oversight planted seeds of guilt that would grow with time, waiting for nights like this to test whether I had learned enough to endure. I should have known the moment I stepped onto the eastern catwalk that Rule 4, never enter areas marked with warning lights after midnight, existed for reasons far beyond mere protocol. The glow of the amber lights cast odd, elongated shadows along the metal grates, and the further I walked, the more the floor seemed to stretch beneath me. Every step felt like it consumed more time than it should, the rhythm of my boots echoing longer, slower, almost offbeat with the usual cadence of the rig. I reminded myself of the rule as my eyes traced the glowing hazard signals, trying to convince myself that caution would suffice. Yet the lights pulsed in a way that seemed almost alive, beckoning and warning simultaneously. The corridor twisted subtly, a trick of perspective, or perhaps something else, and I realized that even my sense of direction was bending under the weight of the night. As I pressed forward, the warning lights painted the walls in patterns that made the steel appear fluid, bending and folding in ways that no normal structure should. I tried counting steps to ground myself, but each step seemed to take longer, the distance between hatches stretching impossibly, as if the rig itself was manipulating perception. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, elongating, retreating, moving in tandem with my thoughts rather than independently, and I found myself questioning whether time had paused for everyone but me. The pulse of the lights was rhythmic, matching some internal heartbeat I hadn't noticed, and I realized I could no longer trust the usual measures of speed or space. Even air itself felt thicker in the corridor, pressing against my lungs and slowing the cadence of my breathing. I reached for the handrails, gripping them tightly, and every twist of metal seemed slightly different from before, worn in ways I couldn't have imagined. The warning lights illuminated cables and conduits that I was certain hadn't been there moments ago, or perhaps my memory of the rig's layout was faltering. The longer I walked, the more I felt that hours could collapse into minutes, or minutes could stretch into hours, and there was no way to tell which was happening. Every slight noise, a clatter, a hum, a subtle creak, made me freeze and recalibrate, counting on the rule to guide me even when all else failed. I whispered it quietly, more as a mantra than a reminder. Rule 4. Never enter areas marked with warning lights after midnight. Letting the words anchor my fractured perception. By the time I passed the first set of hatches, the distortion grew unbearable. I tried to mark distances with the lights, noting flickers and shifts, but the rig seemed to rewrite itself as I moved. A hatch I had just stepped past now appeared further down the corridor than memory allowed. I questioned whether I had walked in circles, or if the space had truly warped around me, and a creeping panic set in. The rule, simple as it seemed, was my only measure of sanity. Obey it, and I might survive. Break it, and I might cease to understand even the rig itself. My eyes traced every reflection, every flicker of light, desperate to measure reality against the only fixed point I could trust, the warning lights themselves. As I ventured further, I began noticing small details that shouldn't have existed, rust patterns that shifted slightly, cables crossing in ways that defied geometry, panels that seemed to stretch vertically as I approached. My sense of time disintegrated entirely. I could not tell whether minutes or hours had passed. The rhythm of my heartbeat, the cadence of the wind outside, the pulse of the machinery, it all blended into one fluid, unmeasurable experience. I reminded myself once again of Rule 4, never enter areas marked with warning lights after midnight, mentally reciting it with desperate precision, feeling the words anchor me even as everything else around me distorted. The longer I continued, the more I began to sense patterns in the shifting lights and shadows, as if the rig itself was alive and aware of my passage. Every step forward felt like a negotiation with the structure, with the night, with the rigid boundaries of rules that were meant to contain it. My reflection in metal panels grew elongated, twisted, sometimes ahead of me, and at moments I could swear it moved independently of my body. I realized that obeying Rule 4 wasn't merely about avoiding danger, it was about resisting the pull of the rig's manipulation of perception, about keeping my mind tethered to a reality that was slipping. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, I was trembling, my chest tight, my vision flickering between warped distances and impossible angles. I could not tell how long I had walked, how long I had obeyed the rule, or whether obeying it would be enough. Every corner of the rig seemed to remember my presence, as though time itself had layered traces of my movement, replaying them subtly to test my attention. My body felt both heavy and unmoored, and I realized the rig's silent sentience measured not only compliance with the rule, but also my mental endurance. I clung to Rule 4, never enter areas marked with warning lights after midnight, knowing that each repeated breath, each careful step, was the only tether I had left to reality. Even as the first pale light of dawn began to seep in through narrow vents, I couldn't trust the measurements of the world around me. Distances had stretched and compressed, shadows had multiplied and elongated, and I felt every second of the night pressed against my chest like lead. The warning lights no longer served merely as indicators, they were markers of a time and space I could no longer map. I understood, with a creeping certainty, that the rig didn't merely house machinery, it reshaped perception itself, and the rule existed to keep me anchored amidst the slow distortion of reality. And as I finally turned back toward the upper platforms, exhausted and hollow, I could feel the pulse of the rig lingering in my mind, a reminder that obeying Rule 4 had preserved my body, but not my sense of certainty. It started almost imperceptibly, a gentle rhythmic tap echoing through the steel beneath my boots. and I instantly remembered Rule 5. Never ignore the faint tapping from below the platform. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, trying to convince myself it was just the rig settling or the distant waves striking the supports. But the cadence was deliberate, precise, and almost impatient, as if something or someone was aware of my every movement above. My hands clenched the railing instinctively, my knuckles white, and I whispered the rule under my breath, repeating it like a protective charm against the invisible presence. Each tap resonated through the metal underfoot, vibrating my legs, and the more I tried to ignore it, the louder it seemed, pressing against my focus with a rhythm that mocked my attempts at reason. I took slow, careful steps along the catwalk, every instinct screaming at me to move faster, but Rule 5 anchored me in place. The tapping persisted, coming in uneven bursts now, sometimes closer, sometimes further, almost teasing, almost aware of my attempts to gauge its source. I tried peering over the edge, straining to see the lower structures bathed in faint shadows, but the darkness seemed to swallow any hint of what might be down there. The rig itself groaned in response to my motion, blending mechanical echoes with the mysterious tapping, and I could not distinguish the natural from the deliberate. My heartbeat matched the erratic rhythm, and I realized that the tapping had begun to embed itself in my perception, dictating the pace of my thoughts, shaping the tension in my chest. Hours dragged as I followed the tapping along the perimeter of the platform, careful not to step too close to the edge while my mind began to fracture. The sound seemed to shift in pitch and speed depending on my attention, almost as if it responded to whether I was watching, listening, or pretending not to notice. Shadows beneath the platform stretched in ways that defied geometry, folding and curling along beams and supports that should have remained static. I whispered fragments of the rule repeatedly, the words a fragile tether, Rule 5. Never ignore the faint tapping from below the platform. Even the act of repeating it felt insufficient against the invisible threat, and I realized the tapping wasn't just sound, it was a presence, testing, probing, making sure I understood the consequences of inattentiveness. The tapping began to form patterns I couldn't predict. At times it synchronized with my own movements, echoing every step I took, every subtle shift in balance, as though counting and recording. I tried measuring the intervals, noting each pause, but the rhythm would subtly change when I wasn't looking directly at the source. It was maddening, a game I couldn't hope to win. The rig's metal bones transmitted vibrations in unpredictable ways, making it impossible to tell what was mechanical, what was environmental, and what was deliberately designed to unsettle me. Each step became a negotiation between obeying the rule, avoiding detection, and surviving the oppressive weight of unknown awareness pressing from below. I started murmuring, talking quietly to myself, just to maintain a connection to reality, listing the hatches I had checked, the monitors I had watched, trying to maintain a chronology that seemed to unravel the moment I considered the tapping. Sometimes I imagined faces staring up from the darkness. Sometimes I imagined machinery moving in impossible ways. My imagination bled into reality, and I had to remind myself with the rule itself that attention was the only safeguard. Rule 5. Never ignore the faint tapping from below the platform. Each repetition was a lifeline, a fragile anchor against the creeping certainty that whatever was beneath was not bound by ordinary perception, that it existed in a space my mind could only approach through fear. By the early hours of the next day, exhaustion had warped my perception further. The taps slowed, then quickened, then stopped, only to begin again moments later, as though measuring my persistence. I realized I had walked the perimeter dozens of times without leaving any section unchecked, my muscles screaming in fatigue, my mind fraying, yet the tapping never relented. It was patient, precise, and indifferent to my suffering. Shadows beneath the platform had begun to form abstract shapes that mimicked movements I had never made, reflections that seemed to dance in rhythm with the sound below. I understood that the tapping wasn't just a test of attention, it was an intimate knowledge of my fear, a slow accumulation of psychological pressure, and that breaking the rule even once would have consequences I could not begin to imagine. Even when the first light of morning streaked across the rig, the tapping left a residue in my mind. Every vibration, every creak of metal, every breeze that slid along my neck recalled it with surgical precision. The rule had anchored me in a fragile equilibrium, but I knew the next night would be worse, that the unseen entity below had catalogued my movements and would adjust its rhythm to find cracks in my focus. Obedience to Rule 5, never ignore the faint tapping from below the platform, had preserved my body, but my mind had been rearranged, forced to stretch thin across hours of silent calculation, anticipation, and fear. I realized survival was no longer about physical stamina, it was entirely mental, and the tapping was a teacher that demanded complete, unbroken attention. By the time I returned to the upper levels, the rig felt alien. The familiar catwalks, the control rooms, even the hazard lights seemed distorted, as if the tapping below had left an imprint, a subtle reminder that nothing would ever be ordinary again. Every shadow along the railing felt heavy, every whisper of wind seemed to carry the rhythm I had tried to ignore. I could not yet rest. The tapping had burrowed into my consciousness, a ghostly heartbeat that followed me wherever I went. And even as the sun rose over the horizon, I could feel the silent pressure from below, the unyielding reminder that Rule 5, never ignore the faint tapping from below the platform, was still alive, still waiting, and would return the moment I faltered again. The moment I realized I had no choice but to enter the flooded lower compartments, I remembered Rule 6, never attempt repairs alone in the flooded compartments, and felt my stomach knot as I descended into the dimly lit passageways. Water pooled in the corners, reflecting flickering emergency lights, and the smell of rust and oil hung heavy in the air. I had convinced myself it was a simple fix, replace a corroded valve, and the section would be stable. But the moment my boots hit the shallow water, I understood the danger of being alone. The rig had always been mechanical, predictable, and yet the water twisted the acoustics, amplifying every drip and gurgle into an almost sentient presence that seemed aware of my intrusion. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I stepped cautiously, the rule repeating in my mind, a lifeline tethering me to a sense of reason. The deeper I waded, the more disorienting the compartment became. Pipes curved in impossible angles, valves shimmered wetly in the weak light, and the sound of my own breathing bounced back at me, distorted, as if someone or something was mocking my presence. Each step I took felt like it sank slightly further into an unseen weight, and I had to stop repeatedly to steady myself, gripping the railings and repeating Rule 6, never attempt repairs alone in the flooded compartments, like a whispered incantation. The rule wasn't just caution, it was a boundary, a line drawn between survival and catastrophe. Every splash of water, every creak of stressed metal reminded me that being alone here was a gamble with a rig that remembered mistakes. I began the repairs methodically, hands trembling as I reached for corroded bolts, and realized that the water carried a subtle current I hadn't noticed before. Small eddies tugged at my clothing, seeming almost purposeful, guiding me toward areas I had intended to avoid. My heartbeat raced, and for a moment I thought I heard a soft sigh, though I could not tell if it came from air trapped in the pipes or something far less ordinary. The rule anchored me in my awareness. Rule 6, never attempt repairs alone in the flooded compartments, reminded me to keep focus, to anticipate hazards, and to avoid letting fear dictate my movements. But the isolation pressed in from all sides, making rational thought difficult. Hours passed, each movement slow and deliberate, as I tightened, replaced, and checked every component I could reach. The water rose slightly with every shift of the rig, waves lapping against my thighs and chest, amplifying my exhaustion. I began noticing irregularities in the reflections, shadows that didn't align with the structure, shapes that seemed to move independently, and tiny ripples that defied explanation. The thought that Rule 6 existed for a reason beyond protocol pressed on me, heavier than the steel beams overhead, and I realized that the risk of attempting these repairs alone wasn't just physical, it was psychological, a subtle erosion of confidence and rationality. I spoke quietly to myself, naming every action, labeling every valve, reciting every measurement, trying to create a framework to survive the overwhelming pressure. At one point, I dropped a wrench, and the sound echoed unnaturally long, bouncing against walls and water like a question unanswered. My ears strained for further irregularities, my eyes darting to every shadow, every reflection, every ripple in the water. I whispered the rule again, Rule 6, never attempt repairs alone in the flooded compartments, as if repeating it might convince whatever presence lingered that I was obedient, careful, and aware. Each repetition gave a temporary sense of control, though I could feel my mind bending, stretching to accommodate the weight of isolation and the omnipresent threat of the flooded compartment. As time blurred, I felt my own pulse in sync with the rhythm of dripping water. The rig seemed alive in subtle ways I had never noticed before, small vibrations beneath my boots, microshifts of pipes, soft creaks that suggested movement beyond my field of vision. Every step, every motion required calculation, attention, and acknowledgement of Rule 6, because any lapse could mean losing not just equipment, but grip on reality itself. I started measuring the water's depth in my mind, mapping my path meticulously, knowing that one misstep could have irreversible consequences in a compartment that swallowed mistakes like teeth. By the early hours of the morning, I had completed the most critical repairs, but the mental toll was immense. I realized that obeying the rule hadn't just kept me physically safe, it had preserved what remained of my mind. Every shadow, every distorted reflection in the water, every unpredictable groan of the rig had been a test of my focus, endurance, and composure. The solitude of the flooded compartments had been nearly absolute, yet I could feel a presence, a subtle awareness that monitored every movement, making me question if being alone was ever truly safe. The rule existed to remind me that survival depended on acknowledgement of limits, and that failure to observe those limits carried consequences that weren't always immediate, but always permanent. Returning to the upper platforms, wet, exhausted, and shaking, I understood why Rule 6, never attempt repairs alone in the flooded compartments, had been drilled into every new crew member. It wasn't merely about procedure or risk, it was about sanity, about avoiding the slow psychological erosion that came from isolation and confrontation with forces the mind cannot fully grasp. I could feel residual currents brushing against my boots, shadows from the compartments creeping into my awareness, and I knew the rig would not forget my presence. Even as I leaned against a railing, shivering and gasping for clean air, I understood that the flooded compartments held more than water. They held consequences, memories, and judgments that lingered long after one left. I remembered clearly the first time I truly feared the rig would betray me, the cold sweat forming at my temples, as Rule 7, never touch the signal panel when the main alarm is silent, echoed in my mind. The control room seemed too quiet that night, a deceptive calm that settled over the blinking lights and idle consoles. I was alone, or so I thought, and the rig's usual hum was faint, almost comforting, until I noticed the faint irregular flicker of the signal panel, beckoning as though aware of my gaze. My hands itched to interact, to test whether the panel was merely inactive or hiding some subtle error, but the rule anchored me, a hard boundary etched in countless warnings. I whispered it to myself like a lifeline. Rule 7. Never touch the signal panel when the main alarm is silent. Yet the temptation to intervene lingered, pressing on my mind with insidious weight. The longer I stood there, the more I noticed anomalies in the room. Lights shifted subtly when I looked away. Displays that should have remained static pulsed faintly, and I could swear that reflections on the steel panels moved independently, as if observing me. My rational mind fought against panic, insisting it was fatigue, projection, or shadows cast by machinery, but the rig seemed to test my restraint with quiet precision. I traced my fingers along the edge of the signal panel, feeling the cold metal, the smooth, unyielding surface, and each brush of my skin sent a shiver through my body. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, and I realized that obeying Rule 7 was no longer about avoiding mechanical error. It was about avoiding a trap I could not fully comprehend. Hours passed, my vigilance unwavering yet my mind fraying. The rule had become a living presence in my consciousness, repeating silently whenever my thoughts wandered toward curiosity or impatience. Every flicker of a warning light, every irregularity in data streams, every minor vibration in the rig felt amplified, as though the structure itself measured my compliance. I tried focusing on routine tasks, recalibrating sensors, logging readings, but the presence of the panel, idle and yet unnervingly active, made concentration impossible. My pulse raced with every imagined movement on the screens, and the knowledge that Rule 7 never touched the signal panel when the main alarm is silent existed to prevent consequences I couldn't predict weighed heavily, like a knife pressed against the back of my consciousness. I began murmuring to myself, cataloging every detail of the room, every movement in shadows, every subtle variation in the panels, trying to anchor myself to reality. At one point, I thought I saw a cursor blink where it should not, or perhaps my mind conjured it from exhaustion. The rig seemed alive in ways I could not quantify. It reminded me, punished me, and questioned my judgment simultaneously. The silence of the alarm was oppressive, stretching seconds into minutes, minutes into an unmeasurable span, and I felt a creeping guilt for even considering touching the panel. The rule was no longer procedural. It was protective, psychological, an invisible tether holding me from committing an act that might irreversibly alter my perception. By the early hours, I realized my movements were dictated less by necessity and more by instinct, the rig testing my patience and my obedience. Every step away from the panel made it seem closer. Every blink made its subtle pulse more noticeable. Shadows in the corners stretched unnaturally, forming shapes that resembled figures I could almost recognize, and my mind quivered at the possibility of leaving the control room. Rule 7, never touch the signal panel when the main alarm is silent, had become a mantra, repeated silently, yet firmly, a fragile line between survival and mental collapse. I understood the gravity of disobedience in a rig that measured even intention, a lesson imprinted through fear and lingering doubt. Even when dawn crept along the horizon, illuminating the steel beams and blinking lights in pale clarity, the memory of temptation lingered. I could feel the rig's attention, the subtle judgment embedded in every reflection and flicker, and I realized the silence of the alarm was a snare I had narrowly avoided. Obeying Rule 7 had preserved both body and mind, but the experience left a residue, a gnawing unease that the rig itself might anticipate my attention and exploit it later. Each day afterward, I approached the signal panel with respect bordering on fear, and I understood that the rule was not just about safety. It was about submitting to a system far older, smarter, and more patient than I could ever hope to outmaneuver. By the time I left the control room, legs trembling, vision slightly blurred, I knew the rule would not release me from its weight. It lingered in the quiet hum of the rig, in the flicker of lights, in the faint pressure in my chest whenever I passed the signal panel. Survival was no longer just procedural, it was relational, a constant negotiation between obedience and curiosity, vigilance and paranoia. I could feel the rig measuring me still, cataloging each moment of hesitation, each imagined interaction, each heartbeat, and as I ascended to the upper catwalk, careful not to glance at the inactive panel, I understood that Rule 7, never touch the signal panel when the main alarm is silent, had preserved my life, but it had reshaped my understanding of trust, authority, and the invisible intelligence that governed this platform. It started as a simple trick of the light, the steel beams casting elongated, irregular shapes across the catwalk. But I immediately remembered Rule 8, never follow the shadows into the maintenance tunnels, and froze in place. The rig was silent, except for the low hum of machinery, yet the shadows stretched unnaturally, curling along corners and edges, moving slightly as if with intent. My eyes darted nervously, calculating every angle, every flicker of darkness, and I realized the shapes were teasing, almost beckoning me toward the narrow tunnel entrances below. I whispered the rule repeatedly, trying to anchor myself. But the shadows seemed aware, responding subtly to my gaze, curling closer when I dared glance away. My heart raced, and every instinct screamed to obey, yet curiosity gnawed at me, a dangerous companion in the oppressive isolation of the rig. Stepping back felt impossible. The shadows moved with a life of their own, bending and stretching in ways that contradicted every law of geometry I knew. I could see traces of light reflecting off wet panels, yet the dark patches seemed to absorb it, shifting imperceptibly to match the edges of my vision. Each step along the catwalk brought me closer to the tunnel mouths, and I felt an almost physical tug toward them, a subtle force warping my sense of balance. I whispered Rule 8, never follow the shadows into the maintenance tunnels. Again, a protective mantra against the pull, but I could feel the psychological decay creeping in, my mind twisting to rationalize the urge to peer into those forbidden depths. The shadows seemed patient, and I understood they would wait indefinitely, testing the boundaries of attention, fear, and obedience. I tried to distract myself with routine checks, cataloging equipment and recalibrating sensors, but the shadows persisted at the edges of my vision. Each flicker of movement made my stomach churn, my pulse quicken, and my fingers twitch involuntarily toward tools I didn't need yet. I felt the creeping erosion of my mental defenses, the slow descent into hyper-awareness, where every sound, every vibration, and every reflected light became a threat. The maintenance tunnels, normally innocuous and predictable, now seemed impossible to map accurately. Their entrances bent subtly, their interiors suggested depth that I could not measure. The rig was feeding off my attention, exploiting curiosity and fatigue in equal measure, and I realized that Rule 8 was as much about preserving my mind as it was about physical safety. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last, and the shadows became almost tangible, curling around corners, pooling beneath railings, and flickering in patterns that suggested a deliberate intelligence. I tried convincing myself that fatigue, monotony, or isolation had conjured them, but my gut told me otherwise. I could feel the rig watching, waiting for a misstep, a single glance too long, a step too close to the forbidden passages. The shadows seemed to respond to my hesitations, sometimes moving closer, sometimes retreating, always drawing attention, always measuring compliance with Rule 8. Never follow the shadows into the maintenance tunnels. Obedience was the only shield, yet it was invisible, fragile, and easily broken by the lure of curiosity. At times I imagined figures lurking within the darkness, glimpses of faces and hands that weren't there when I blinked. My mind began filling gaps with details that seemed plausible, yet impossible. Footsteps echoing far below, shapes bending around corners, and the low creak of metal that implied movement where none should exist. I tried to steady my breathing, counting slowly, reciting the rule like a mantra, each repetition a fragile tether keeping the shadows at bay. The compulsion to peer into the tunnels was relentless, and I realized the rig wasn't just testing my obedience, it was actively manipulating perception, creating a slow, subtle decay of cognition, a mental erosion that left no room for error. By the early hours of morning, I had walked the catwalks countless times, each step monitored by the interplay of light and shadow, every reflection off metal, every flicker of the amber hazard lights, every subtle movement in the peripheral vision, felt purposeful, designed to measure whether I would falter. I understood the consequences of breaking Rule 8. Never follow the shadows into the maintenance tunnels. Not just physical danger, but the near certain collapse of my ability to trust my own senses. My body was exhausted, my mind stretched thin, yet the shadows persisted, patient and unrelenting, a psychological predator that fed on hesitation, doubt, and curiosity. I could feel the rig itself shaping reality, bending time and perception in ways I had no means of countering. Even as daylight crept along the steel catwalks, the memory of the shadows lingered in my vision and thoughts. Every reflection, every shift in light, every glint of water reminded me of the forbidden passages below. I realized that the rig's corridors, normally mundane and familiar, had become instruments of psychological decay, the shadows themselves agents of subtle terror, and the rule was the only protection. Obedience had preserved my mind, but not entirely. Every glance, every thought toward the tunnels left a residue, a creeping paranoia that would follow me across shifts and nights. And as I finally stepped back from the catwalk edge, exhausted and trembling, I understood that Rule 8, never follow the shadows into the maintenance tunnels, would linger with me, a quiet, insidious reminder that some paths were never meant to be explored. The first time I saw the containers floating just beyond the rig's platform, rocking gently with the current, I remembered Rule 9, never attempt to retrieve the drifting containers alone, and felt a sharp pang of guilt. I had convinced myself that I could secure them quickly, that no one needed to know I'd stepped beyond protocol, and that the task was trivial. The sea beneath churned slightly, reflecting the harsh amber lights from the rig, and every shadow cast seemed magnified, as if observing my decision. My boots slipped on the wet grating as I approached the edge, heart hammering, and a voice in my head reminded me of the rule I had ignored countless times in training. It was meant to protect not just life but sanity, and yet the lure of doing it alone seemed irresistible. I rigged a rope and lowered the first hook toward the drifting containers, the water rising against the metal supports in slow, deliberate waves. Each tug felt heavier than it should, as though the ocean itself resisted my interference. My hands cramped from tension, and my mind began running through potential consequences. If the rope snapped, if the containers shifted too quickly, if I lost footing, none of it was hypothetical. The isolation of the rig compounded every risk, leaving me acutely aware of my vulnerability. I could feel the weight of the rule pressing down on me. Rule 9, never attempt to retrieve the drifting containers alone, a stark reminder that some tasks were never meant for one person, no matter how capable they believed themselves to be. Minutes stretched, the containers slipping slightly with each wave, testing my patience and strength. My gaze flickered constantly between the swinging crates and the rig above, seeking confirmation that someone was watching, someone could intervene if necessary, but there was no one. The night pressed in, cold and silent, and my body trembled from exertion and fear, muscles screaming for relief. Each pull of the rope felt like a negotiation with fate itself, a balance between success and the punishment of disobedience. I kept repeating the rule silently, trying to ground myself, each syllable a lifeline against the creeping awareness that my actions were reckless, dangerous, and morally questionable. I began imagining scenarios where the containers slipped entirely, dragging me with them into the black waters below. Every shadow on the rig seemed to shift, the flicker of lights casting unfamiliar angles that made familiar structures seem alien. My mind twisted through hypothetical outcomes, guilt amplifying each imagined failure. The rule had existed for this very reason, to prevent a moral failure compounded by physical disaster. Yet I had ignored it, and the weight of that negligence settled on me like a physical burden, a moral imprint that pressed as heavily as the steel beneath my boots. By the time I managed to secure the first container, exhaustion and anxiety had fully intertwined. My hands were slick with water and oil, the rope cut into my palms, and every movement required precise coordination and unwavering attention. The second container, however, slipped farther with the waves, and I had no choice but to reach toward it, balancing precariously along the edge of the platform. The thought of falling, of being dragged into the black waters, surged through me, and I whispered the rule once more. Rule 9, never attempt to retrieve the drifting containers alone, a fragile acknowledgement of the wisdom I had ignored. Each word reverberated through my mind like a bell, reminding me that survival was not just about physical endurance, but about moral accountability, about recognizing limits. Hours seemed to collapse into one continuous motion as I finally secured the containers to the rig. My arms shook, my back screamed in protest, and the rig beneath me groaned in response to each movement, as if aware of my struggle. I felt the weight of isolation acutely, realizing that had anything gone wrong, there would have been no assistance, no immediate rescue. The rule's significance became terrifyingly clear. It was a guardrail against personal failure and against the broader consequences that could ripple across the crew and rig. Ignoring it was not merely reckless, it was a moral lapse with potential irreversible consequences. Even after the containers were safely tethered, I could not rest. Every shadow, every wave, every flicker of light reminded me of the momentary lapse in judgment, the quiet risk I had taken for the sake of perceived competence. I understood that survival on the rig was as much about obeying the rules as it was about performing tasks, and that Rule 9, never attempt to retrieve the drifting containers alone, was a reminder that individual bravery carried consequences far beyond the self. The sea was patient, the rig was silent, and yet the memory of that night would linger, a moral imprint I could not erase. Returning to the upper platform, soaked and trembling, I felt the rig observing me in ways I could not measure. Every creak, every groan, every subtle movement seemed amplified, echoing the lesson the rule had embedded in me. I realized the drifting containers were not just physical objects, they were instruments of accountability, symbols of the boundary between reckless courage and disciplined obedience. Obedience had preserved my life, but ignoring the rule had left its mark on my conscience, a reminder that rules existed not merely for survival, but for moral consequence. And as I finally leaned against the railing, shaking and exhausted, I understood that Rule 9, never attempt to retrieve the drifting containers alone, would echo in my mind every time the sea stirred against the rig, a quiet, insistent warning that certain actions carry weight beyond measurement. I hesitated at the doorway, staring into the cold metallic chamber, and immediately recalled Rule 10, never enter the Mariana Trench observation chamber after the lights flicker. The fluorescent panels above had stuttered moments before, plunging the room into uneven shadows that seemed impossibly dense. Every instinct screamed that entering now would be madness, yet something unnameable tugged at me, a combination of curiosity, dread, and duty. The rig's hum felt distorted, deeper, vibrating through my chest in time with some unperceived rhythm. My flashlight flickered in the corner, mimicking the malfunctioning ceiling lights, and I felt the faint pressure of the trench itself, miles below, as if it was aware of my presence and impatient. Repeating the rule aloud felt necessary, a protective chant against a chamber that seemed alive, waiting. Stepping cautiously inside, the shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, folding along angles that didn't exist before. Each step seemed to extend time, the distance between me and the far observation window elongating, contracting, then stretching again. I could see the trench through the thick, reinforced glass, a black void swallowing every sense of depth and distance, yet the water beyond seemed almost too still, unnervingly patient. The rig itself seemed to stretch and compress as I moved, the metal vibrating subtly underfoot in response to my attention. The rule, Rule 10, never enter the Mariana Trench observation chamber after the lights flicker, was the only anchor preventing my mind from unraveling entirely in the face of distorted time and spatial impossibility. Hours, or was it minutes, passed as I approached the observation window, my pulse sinking with the erratic flicker of the lights above. The trench loomed below, immense and indifferent, and I felt a subtle shift, as though the abyss itself bent perception around my body. I tried to measure the depth, the distance, the angle of the water, but everything warped and twisted beyond rational comprehension. Shadows in the chamber seemed to detach slightly from objects, floating, curling, elongating, and retreating in tandem with my glances. The rig's mechanisms whined softly, subtly altering pitch, and I could feel my sense of duration fragmenting, collapsing into a rhythm dictated by the chamber rather than the clocks I carried. Obedience to Rule 10 was no longer procedural, it was survival in a perceptual storm. At one point, the lights flickered again, more violently, plunging the room into near darkness punctuated only by faint emergency glows. I froze, chest tightening, convinced that the trench had shifted, that its blackness had moved closer, pressing against the chamber's thick glass. Every reflection became suspect. Every vibration along the floor felt like communication or warning. I whispered the rule again. Rule 10. Never enter the Mariana Trench observation chamber after the lights flicker, hoping repetition could anchor me against the slow unraveling of time and reality around me. My eyes darted, tracing every edge, every shadow, every wavering light, but the chamber itself seemed to breathe, expanding subtly, folding space in imperceptible ways, a predator patient and calculating. As I moved deeper into the chamber, I noticed subtle inconsistencies. Panels that had been flat now appeared concave, the floor rising slightly beneath my feet in some areas, the walls reflecting angles I knew couldn't exist. I realized my mind was warping in response to isolation and fatigue, yet the trench beyond felt distinctly alive, aware of my movements, monitoring my gaze, testing my obedience. Every time I considered touching a console, adjusting a valve, or leaning too close to the observation glass, I reminded myself of Rule 10, my mental tether in a room that no longer adhered to conventional physics. The rig, the trench, the flickering lights, they conspired to distort perception, forcing me into hyper-awareness, fracturing my understanding of space and time. Time became meaningless. The chamber stretched in impossible increments, seconds dragging into what felt like hours, while hours collapsed into fleeting blinks. My reflection in the glass showed a version of me slightly altered each glance, subtle differences in posture, expression, and posture, as though multiple iterations of my presence coexisted. I realized that entering the chamber after a flicker didn't just risk immediate danger. It allowed the trench, the rig, and some subtle force to manipulate perception itself, eroding certainty, memory, and identity. The rule's repetition anchored me, a fragile barrier. Rule 10. Never enter the Mariana Trench observation chamber after the lights flicker. Without it, I would have succumbed to time's distortion entirely. By the early hours of morning, I had navigated the chamber cautiously, observing instruments, monitoring reflections, and resisting the pull of curiosity toward the black depths below. The lights had stopped flickering, or at least the disturbance had lessened, yet I felt residual distortions, elongated shadows, warped angles, and a subtle vibration that hinted at the trench's presence far below. I realized that obeying the rule had preserved both my body and mind, but the experience left a permanent imprint, a sense that time was fluid, that perception was unreliable, and that the Mariana Trench had claimed a small portion of my certainty. Even as I exited the chamber, stepping onto the stable platform above, I understood that Rule 10, never enter the Mariana Trench observation chamber after the lights flicker, would haunt my awareness every time the amber light stuttered, every time the rig shivered in response to the sea. The moment I approached the viewport that looked out into the endless darkness of the ocean, a shiver ran down my spine, and I recalled Rule 11. Never acknowledge what lurks beyond the viewport. Some things exist only to be unseen. The water outside was unnervingly still, black as oil, reflecting the faint amber lights of the rig. I wanted to look, to understand, to measure some impossible threat, yet the rule anchored me in place, reminding me that certain knowledge came at too high a cost. The glass was cold under my hands, condensation forming patterns that seemed to shift as I tried to focus, and I could feel a subtle pressure from the abyss itself, as if the ocean and whatever inhabited it were aware of my hesitation. I whispered the rule softly, a futile incantation against the compulsion to look closer, to glimpse beyond the barrier that separated me from forces I was never meant to see. Every shift in the viewport seemed alive, bending light, creating shapes that my mind tried to comprehend but failed. I could sense movement in the water beyond, subtle yet deliberate, almost patient, and every time I considered acknowledging it, a surge of instinctive fear rooted me to the platform. Shadows danced along the rig's metal frame, casting elongated, impossible angles, and I realized that the viewport acted like a conduit, a boundary where perception and reality blurred. Rule 11. Never acknowledge what lurks beyond the viewport. Some things exist only to be unseen, echoed in my mind with renewed urgency, reminding me that the abyss outside wasn't empty. It was aware, and any recognition could be catastrophic. I tried pacing, keeping my attention divided, checking consoles, monitoring gauges, and calibrating instruments. But the weight of the viewport pressed on me, a silent invitation to look, to understand. Time seemed to warp here, stretching seconds into minutes, minutes into hours, and I felt the rig itself bending subtly under some invisible force. Every reflection in the glass seemed slightly off, every vibration in the platform resonating in ways that suggested intelligence beyond comprehension. My mind began to fragment, attention snapping from one detail to another, but the rule remained my anchor. The abyss could not be acknowledged without consequence, and yet, in my periphery, I could sense it testing the boundary of obedience. At one point, I thought I saw shapes beyond the viewport, fleeting, curling just beneath the water's surface, their presence almost tangible yet ungraspable. My pulse quickened, breath shallow, and I whispered the rule again. Rule 11. Never acknowledge what lurks beyond the viewport. Some things exist only to be unseen, as if repetition could shield me from a gaze I could not reciprocate. I realized the danger was not in what was visible, but in the act of recognition itself, the acknowledgement of something ancient, patient, and deliberate. Each shift of water, each wavering shadow along the rig, each subtle vibration felt like a communication I wasn't equipped to interpret. My mind began filling in the gaps, conjuring forms that defied physics, yet I knew the real horror existed whether I perceived it or not. Hours, or maybe days, passed as I stood by the viewport, trapped between obedience and compulsion, every instinct screaming to look, yet every rational thought tethered by the rule. The rig groaned and vibrated subtly, lights flickering in patterns that I could not reconcile, and I felt the creeping dissolution of time and identity pressing on me. Every glance at the viewport risked acknowledgement, every peripheral observation a potential breach of survival, and the weight of isolation intensified, pressing the horizon of consciousness into jagged edges. The abyss beyond was patient. The rule was my only defense against being consumed, not physically, but mentally, slowly eroding perception, memory, and will. I spoke quietly to myself, cataloging every panel, every gauge, every shift in pressure and current, repeating each observation to maintain sanity. Yet I could feel it, whatever existed beyond the viewport, coiling awareness around the edges of my mind. I tried to map, to rationalize, to quantify the threat, but the very act of comprehension felt dangerous. Shadows and reflections in the glass mocked precision, bending angles, folding light, and multiplying infinitely. My attention wavered constantly, yet the rule provided a fragile tether. Rule 11. Never acknowledge what lurks beyond the viewport. Some things exist only to be unseen, reminded me of the boundary I could never cross, the limit I could never test, and the patience of whatever lay beneath the waves was infinite. Exhaustion eventually blurred perception further. Shapes became suggestions, reflections doubled, time stretched and collapsed, and the rig itself seemed to breathe beneath me. I knew the abyss had not been empty, that acknowledgement itself could manifest consequences I could not yet anticipate. I could feel its awareness stretching across the distance, pressing subtly, patient, unyielding. The viewport was not just a window, it was a boundary, a mirror for my mind, a tether to rules I could not break without paying the cost. I understood finally that obeying Rule 11 was survival in its purest form, restraint, recognition of limits, and the impossible task of resisting curiosity. And then as my gaze involuntarily flicked toward the darkness beyond the viewport, the lights shifted again, a subtle stutter that drew my attention elsewhere. I froze, aware that whatever waited beyond could sense my focus, yet at the same time, a part of me recoiled from looking, obeying the rule instinctively. The rig hummed, shadows moved, water pulsed faintly, and I felt the infinite patience of the abyss pressing on me from the other side. My hands trembled, knees weak, breath shallow, as I turned slightly, unable to fully escape the presence, yet drawn by a fragile instinct to survive another shift. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.